Hey everyone, welcome back to the Ktor Server Fundamentals playlist. In the last video, we covered session authentication in Ktor. In this video, we will dive into JWT authentication in Ktor. Let's begin by understanding what JWT authentication is. JSON Web Token or insert JWT is a compact URL shape token format used for securely transmitting information between parties as a JSON object format. It's commonly used for authentication and JSON Web Tokens are stateless, meaning authentication can be verified without making query to the database, which makes them efficient for handling user sessions in APIs and microservices. A JSON Web Token consists of three parts. Let's head over to jwt.io for better understanding. As you can notice, the JWT token consists of three parts. First, second, and the third one. First part being the header, which contains the metadata about the token. Like you can notice algorithm corresponding to value HS256. And second part holds the metadata attached to the token. They are basically called the claims data, token claims data. Like we can attach user information like username, user ID, token expiry, all the information within this payload data. The use of username or user ID in this payload data is when user logs in by adding this token within the request header, then server will know this token is corresponding to this username using the payload data that attached to the token. So this portion, the second portion, contains the information about the payload data. The third part holds the signature, which ensures the integrity of the token using a secret key. The way JWT authentication works is simple. The client makes login request using the credentials like username and password. Then server validates the credential, and if it succeeds, then server generates the token and sends back to the client, and client can use that token to access the protected resource. In case if validation fails, server responds with the failure message. And similarly, for sign up request, clients make the request with the payload. Server checks if the user already exists, then it will return the failure response. In case if user doesn't exist, then it will create a new user and generate the token and sends back to the client. Then client can use that token to access the protected routes. Next, in this video, we will be configuring the JWT authentication plugin. Then we will also create a function to generate the JWT token. And finally, we will set up login, sign up and a protected GET request for complete understanding of JWT authentication flow. Let's start by adding the necessary dependencies. Let's open the version catalog file within this Gradle package, and we can simply duplicate this Ktor server auth line, and we can say Ktor server auth and JWT. Over here as well, we'll say Ktor server auth JWT. So if you have been following through the previous authentication video, you might already have this Ktor server auth module. In case if you don't, then you can simply add this Ktor server auth and Ktor server auth JWT. These are the two dependencies that we will be needing in this video. Now we can head over to the build Gradle file. We can duplicate this line and we can simply say Ktor server auth JWT. We will be needing these two dependency and we can simply sync the project. Now let's configure the JWT authentication plugin. For that, let's move to this plugins package, and within this, let's create a new file JWT authentication. Within this file, we can simply create an extension function configure JWT authentication. To install the authentication plugin, we can simply use install function and pass authentication. To configure the JWT authentication, we can use JWT function and we can pass the name as JWT auth. Now we have this config block. For the configuration, let's add some config within the application conf file. Within this application conf file, let's create a block for JWT config. So let's say JWT. Within this JWT, we will have a secret equals, let's say secret, we will have a issuer with value of HTTP localhost 8080. You can have your domain name as a issuer. Also, we can duplicate this. We can have a audience, and for audience as well, we can have this HTTP localhost 8080, and we can have a realm equals access protected routes. And finally, we can have a expiry as well equals, let's suppose we want to have expiry of 1 day. So for 1 day we can have 86400 seconds, and if we convert this to milliseconds we can append 3 more zeros. So we will have a expiry of 1 day. To represent this JWT config, we can create a data class so that it becomes easier to pass as a parameter. So within this JWT authentication, over here we can create a data class named JWT config. Within this data class, let's have realm of type string, secret of type string, issuer of type string. We can also have audience of type string, and finally we can have a token expiry of type long. We have these 5 properties that represents the JWT config. Within the parameter of this configure JWT authentication, we can get the config of type JWT config. So we will be passing this from our application module function. Now we can set realm equals config.realm. Now for this JWT verification, we need to call this verifier function with the JWT verifier. So let's create an object for JWT verifier. JWT verifier equals JWT dot. Now we can call this require and pass in the algorithm. We can say algorithm dot hmax to 56 and pass the secret. So we can say config dot secret. We can specify with audience with the value of audience. Also we can say with issuer with the value of config dot issuer, and finally we can call this build. Now within this verifier function we can pass this JWT verifier. For the token validation we can call this validate function. Within this we get access to the credentials. So JWT credential, we can access the username as username equals JWT credentials dot payload dot get claim. We can specify the key username and we can get this as a string. So while creating the token, we will be adding the username within the payload part of the token. So within the validate function, we can access that username and we can check is if username is not null or blank. In that case, we can return the JWT principal. So we can say JWT principal and we can simply pass the JWT credentials dot payload, so that within the authenticated route we can get the user information corresponding to the token. In else case, we can simply return the null. So what this will do is, in case if we return the JWT principal, this indicates authorization has been successful and user can access the requested resources. But in case when we return the null, then this will indicate that user is not authorized to access and throw the 401 status code. We can also have this challenge function. So within this challenge function, if authentication fails, like if token has already expired or if token is invalid, then in that case we can simply respond with take. We can say token is not valid or has expired. Also, for status code, we can simply return http status.unauthorized. Since we are not using this, we can simply replace by underscore. So that's it for this configure JWT authentication function. Now let's move to the routing file and set some authentication routes like login, sign up and a protected GET request. In the last video, we created these routes, so we will be reusing them today as well. So now let's start by the sign up route. So within this sign up route, we get the username and password as request body. So we created this serializable auth request data class, so which represents the sign up request data. In case if database already contains the username, we simply responded with user already exists response, and else we inserted the username. For the value we added the password. So this map contains the username as a key and value as a password. Instead of setting sessions, we will be creating a token. So we can say token equals, and we can move back to this JWT authentication file. Below this, we can simply create a function to generate a token. So we can say function generate token, and this will take config as well as username so that we can add this username in claim data. It will return token in a string. We can simply return, and we can say JWT dot create, since we are creating the JWT token. Now we can specify the audience as config dot audience. We can also specify the issuer like config dot issuer. We can set the claim data as well. We can say with claim, and for the key we are specifying username as key, since over here as well while validating we are getting claim as this key username. So while generating token, we'll add the username against this username key. For value we can use this username. We can also set the expiry using with expires at, and we can add the expiry time to the current time millis. So we can say date system dot current time in millis plus we can add the expiry time. Finally, we can say the sign and specify the algorithm dot hmax 256, and we can specify the secret. So over here we are creating a JWT token. We specified the audience, the issuer, also added a claim data so that we can distinguish for which user this token has been generated. We also specified the expiry date, and finally we signed this token using HMAX 256. So over here while verifying as well, we need to ensure that we are using the same config. So we specified that within the application conf file and represented that using this data class so that we use same config while generating as well as while validating the token. Now we can move back to the routing file. Over here we can simply call the generate token function. Now this requires the config, so we can receive the config as a parameter to this function. Now we can pass config equals config, and we can set the username to the one we received from the request data. So we can say request data dot username. Now since token needs to be sent to the client, so instead of respond text we can say respond. We can respond with a map. So map of, we can add a key token with the value of this token. So in this sign up flow, what we are doing is we are first retrieving the username and password. Then we are checking if user already exists in our database. In case we simply responded with a text, else we added the username and the password to our DB map. Then we generated a token using config and the username passed in this request data, and finally we responded with the generated token. So using this token, client can access the protected resource. Now for the login request, we can receive the request data using same call.receive auth request, which has two properties, username and password. Now we can retrieve the stored password using this key. Since in our map we have stored the key username as a key and password as a value, so we can retrieve the stored password using this. If the key doesn't exist, then we can simply respond with this text user doesn't exist. Now we are checking like if stored password equals to the one that we receive from the request data. So if password matches, then we can simply say token equals generate token, and we can pass in the config equals config and username equals the one we receive from the request. So you can say request data the username. Now, instead of responding with text, we can simply respond with the map. So we can say call.respond and we can say map of, then we can specify key as token to the token that we generated. So if password matches, we are simply responding the token that we generate, and using this token, client can make request to the protected resource. If password doesn't match, we simply respond with text invalid credentials. Since JWT authentication is stateless, so we don't have any state preserved in our server, so we can get rid of this logout route. And for this authenticated route, we can change this name to JWT auth, since now we are referring to this JWT auth. Also, now within this GET request, let's respond with a username as well as the expires at. So for that, let's create an instance of principal. Principal equals call dot principal, and we can specify JWT principal. Now for username, we can simply say principal dot payload, and we can get the claim, which is username, and we need to say as a string. So we got access to the username. Now for expires at, we can say expires at equals principal dot expires at dot time, and we can say minus system dot current time is millis. Now we can simply say hello username, and the token expires after expires at milliseconds. So after these milliseconds, our token will get expired. So that's it for the routing part. Let's head over to the application module function. Within this, we can simply comment this configure session authentication, and we can simply call configure JWT authentication. Now, as you can notice, this requires the object for JWT config data class. So, for that, we can simply say val config equals JWT config, and we can simply pass the config object here as well as here. JWT config requires these values. which are present within the application conf file. To access the config within this JWT, which is within this Ktor, what we can say is we can simply refer to this JWT first. So for that we can say val JWT equals environment dot config dot config, and we can specify the path. So it is Ktor dot JWT. So our this JWT is within this Ktor. So to get access to these properties, we can say Ktor dot JWT. For realm, we can say val realm equals JWT dot property, and we can access the realm as realm. So using this key. Now we can say get string, since it is a string. Now similarly for issuer, we can say issuer as a string. For audience, we can say audience. And finally for token expiry, we can say expiry. Now we can convert this token expiry to long, since it is already in the long format within the string. Now we can pass the realm equals realm, issuer equals issuer, audience equals audience, and token expiry equals token expiry. Also we have missed the secret, so we can say secret over here as well, secret, and we can pass secret equals secret. Now that should be it. Now let's run our application. Over here we can try to make request to the protected route. So we are getting token is not verified with 401 status code. So now let's try to sign up, and within the body we can specify username and password. Make sure you select the JSON, and username let's give as user, and for password let's specify 123. So now if we make the request, let's say 401 method not allowed. Since sign up is post request, so we can change it to post, and if we make request again, we get the token. So now to access the protected route, we can simply use this token. So now within our protected get request, we can remove this path, and in authorization, since JWT is based on the barrier token, we can specify the token. So we can paste this token over here. Now if we make the request, we get the username as well. Since our username was user, so we get hello user, and the token expires value as well. So after this milliseconds, this token will be no longer valid. So we'll need to log in again to get the new token after this expires at time. We also have the login route. So using the login route as well, we can get the token. So if we make request, we get the value of token, and this token can be used to make request to the protected resource. So our authentication flow is working as expected. So that's it for this video. In the next one, we will be configuring Google OAuth login, so user can seamlessly sign up using their Google account. So until then, thanks for watching and happy coding.